Hello, I'm Anthony. Welcome to the basic guide to tempo management in Cubase. Tempo is one of those subjects that you can almost completely ignore, despite the fact that every single piece of music you've ever heard has it. But more often than not, we pick a BPM for our song, forget about it, and never think about the subject again. The truth is, though, that Cubase has a very rich feature set of controls that allow us to manipulate the tempo in our song, with potentially very creative results. It also allows us to retain a lot of the organic nature of the music that we write by instructing Cubase to follow the tempo that we set. I'm going to give you some examples of that today. Hope you enjoy this video. Check out the Patreon and channel member links below if you'd like to help support my channel so that I can carry on making these videos. Okay, let's start out nice and simply. We have a static BPM, as you can see down at the bottom of the project, 140 BPM. At the moment, we just have a drum rhythm. Here is the drum rhythm dragged out of Cubase. Very straightforward pattern. I've also dragged a guitar loop out of Media Bay. This guitar loop is recorded at 171 BPM. Here's what it sounds like. If I play those two pieces of music together, it's going to be an absolute train wreck because they're running at different BPMs. It's going to sound awful. Here it is. And so we come to the first of the tempo features that I want to show you in Cubase, and that's the concept of musical mode. You can set any piece of audio in Cubase to adhere to the tempo at that moment in time. So basically, because we've got a static BPM here, I can tell this guitar track to play at 140 BPM. Select the audio in the lower window and make sure you have your definition pane open in the inspector. We have a checkbox up at the top called musical mode, and we activate that. Could not possibly be simpler, but we're not constrained to single tempos either. What we're going to do now is have a look at multiple tempos in a single project. Let's just zoom out slightly. And at this point, I'm going to introduce the tempo track. We don't currently have one in this project. Every project kind of has an invisible tempo track, but until you need more than one tempo, there's no need to see it. We click Add Track, we open the More Tracks drop down, and here is our tempo track. You can only ever have one of them in a project, you don't need more than one, and that's it, it's been added. Ordinarily, I have my tempo track, just as a matter of interest, sat in this top pane, the frozen pane, but for today we'll bring it down here, and I'm going to make it a bit bigger. You can see this greyed out line representing the current project tempo. The tempo track hasn't yet been activated, and this project only has a single tempo. We can activate the tempo track in one of two places. You can do it from the transport bar directly. You can see Activate Tempo Track, or you click the little power button, which is exactly the same function in the tempo track itself. Thanks very much, Cubase, didn't want you to do that. What it's done now is it's set the tempo to 1 BPM, because now that we've activated the tempo track, we need to explicitly tell Cubase what it is we want. Well, I'm going to manually add a new tempo point to this song. You can see one right at the beginning of the project. Well, I don't want this to be 1. Let's set the first one to 150. What I'm going to do now is duplicate the music that we currently have. And the second time round, I'm going to slow it down. So I want to get my pencil tool and I'm going to insert a new tempo mark at 135, that's as reasonable as anything. And you can see that both guitar parts, even though we're now operating at different tempos, still fit perfectly within the 8-bar rule. Cubase has simply time stretched the audio accordingly, according to my instructions, and everything works perfectly well. So that's musical mode covered. Now then, a huge banana skin lies in wait for you with some terrible nomenclature in Cubase. If we hover over this button in the inspector panel, it says switch time base between musical and linear. So has this got anything to do with what we've just done? Because we've set these audio parts to musical mode. So what happens if I turn off this button absolutely nothing at all. You can see that the audio is still perfectly compliant with my requirements. In fact, if we have a look at the audio again and head to the definition, it's still in musical mode. So what's the deal with this button here on the track inspector? This has got nothing to do with the playback of the audio in musical mode. What we're talking about here is how the project is represented as far as the project timeline is concerned. What we're currently looking at here, and actually every project that I write uses bars and beats. You're never going to see a project of mine with time at the top of the project, but some people do work in time. This button in the inspector, switching the time base between musical and linear, is all about the visual representation in the project. In order for me to show you the importance of this button, I'm going to need to hide my camera. Let's do that first. And then go up to the top right-hand corner of the project. You can see this little arrow drop down. I'm going to set the project into time seconds mode instead. As you can see across the top of the project, we're now representing seconds rather than bars and beats. If I'm counting in seconds, the idea of bars and beats is meaningless. And I'm back in the room. But of course, I can still manipulate the tempo. I can still make it go faster or slower, just not within the constraints of bars and beats. So now that we're in time mode, let's mess with the tempo of the song and see what impact this function has. So the first thing that I'm going to do is select the first half of this song, let's call it, because when you have an active tempo track, wherever your song marker is currently located is the value that you can manipulate from the transport bar. You can actually access it here as well. I'll do it from here, why not? So what I'm going to do is speed up the first 8 bars of this song. As I increase or decrease the tempo, the relative position of the music is changing. You can see the information in the top bar saying it's basically going to happen earlier or later. If I switch to linear mode and make adjustments to the tempo, now the guitar part is locked in time. The beginning of the guitar part, the beginning of that first guitar part happens at just before 15 seconds because it's following the adjustment of time. But the drum rhythm, which is still in musical mode, is following the underlying bars and beats structure behind. This is so confusing. I never use this function, I should say. I never click this button. I absolutely despise working in linear mode. And every single track I ever create in Cubase uses musical mode. The reason I'm highlighting it is to show you what it does. This function is all about whether or not you want to represent your project in terms of time or bars and beats. Okay, that's all very well and good for essentially fixed tempo. I know we had one tempo change in that project, but it's basically fixed tempo. What we've got in this project is an acoustic guitar piece that I recorded naturally, and I want Cubase to work out what the tempo track is so that I can put a click track to it and potentially drums and whatever I want. But I want this guitar, this acoustic guitar line to determine or control what the tempo is going to be. Let's have a quick listen to an excerpt of it. So you can hear I'm really stretching the time. When I get to the end of those phrases, I'm making it kind of stretch out quite far. There are also fast and slow sections in this song. There are 2 ways that we can go about this process, making Cubase figure out what the tempo is. The first is to select the audio itself, head into our project menu, say tempo detection, and ask Cubase to analyze the entire audio and figure it out for itself. We'll click the analyze button. It's going to throw this message at you to do with smooth tempo. We're not interested in that today. Let's just say OK. So this is Cubase's first attempt at figuring out the tempo of that piece. Now when you heard it there, it's clearly running at 70, 80, 90 BPM. It's not in the, 198, 202. Cubase has got this tempo wrong by a factor of 2. The first thing that we're going to do is just say divide by 2. Get the same message again. And this is immediately more sensible, more reasonable. At this point, we're going to close this detection panel down. If you leave this detection panel open, any changes that you make to the tempo map essentially recalculate everything from that point onwards for the rest of the song. This is an example of Cubase being too clever for its own good. I find that the tool doesn't work, it's very unreliable, and you end up with very frustrating and difficult results. Give it a go for yourself, but I'm basically recommending you shut the panel down. What that does is lock all of these tempo changes in place, and now we're going to be able to edit them manually wherever we think something's gone slightly wrong. First thing to do though is just put the click track on and listen to a section of this song. It's really not bad. For the most part, it's going to get it pretty much right. You can manually see these strange areas where this is where I've played a long lingering note. And again, it's actually correct. I have slowed down the track and then sped up again when I started playing again. There are going to be sections where it gets it wrong, and this is where this approach kind of falls down. See that I played this very long note and it's incorrectly identified where the beginning of the next section is. This is the beginning of the bar, this transient here, and Cubase has actually determined that it's in the middle of the bar. Fixing this is very difficult. Once Cubase has decided where the tempo is going to be, actually doing these manual corrections turns out to be, in my opinion, more trouble than it's worth. So it's very much specific to how variable the timing of your song is, how strong the transients are, whether or not this is going to work. This is a relatively transient, strong piece, but the tempo changes are so intense that this automatic approach hasn't really worked. Fortunately, we have a second option that we can use. We're not actually going to get Cubase to analyze the audio because it's proved to be too difficult for it. I'm going to throw this tempo track away by right-click, select all events, gone. And I'm going to use a second approach instead, which is to use a drum track instead. I'm going to use the side stick, C#1, to create my own tempo map. What I'm going to do is listen to this piece of music and play where I think the beats should be, and then I'm going to use that to tell Cubase to work out the tempo track. This has its issues too. This is not as easy as it looks, but we'll give it a go. The first thing that I'm going to do actually is to ensure that the beginning of the piece of music, the very first note, which is here, is exactly on a bar. It's on bar 23, that's completely fine. Because when we come to do the tempo correction, I need at least one fixed point of stability. So now I'm going to make sure that click is disabled, don't want anything distracting me. I'm just going to listen to this piece of music and I'll give you a short example of what I would do. Can't talk. Over the top of that, it's too hard to talk over the top while I'm doing that as well. And I made a bit of a mistake at the beginning. But essentially, with that track laid down, I now have what would ordinarily be a fairly accurate representation of all of the beats in the song. If we use this small section as an example, I'll be able to use that because that was reasonably well done. So I'm just going to pick on this very small example. Around that loop, those timing hits were correct. And if they weren't, I can manipulate them. It takes a little bit of zoom in to get exactly what I want, but I basically need to see a really healthy example of the audio and my MIDI notes underneath. If I disable snap, now if I pick those notes up, you can see I can align them perfectly to the audio. You're not going to get better than this. Now, granted, it takes the length of the song to record the thing. You might take 2 or 3 attempts, plus maybe another 15 or 20 minutes of going through and manually editing every one of these hits to make sure that they're exactly on the transients. Make sure you do this as accurately as you possibly can. Don't skimp on this section, because adjusting these MIDI notes manually to where all of those transients are is far and away the easiest way to calculate an accurate tempo. Once you've got that information in your project, you select all of your notes, head into MIDI, functions, calculate tempo from MIDI events, and then we say OK. And now hopefully the click track is enabled I can disable Groove Agent. I don't need those drums, those side stick hits anymore. Let's see if it got that right. Of course it did, because it can't possibly get it wrong. I've manually put those drum notes in. The drum notes are really simple, single, clean, elegant instructions into Cubase. There's no ambiguity, there's no transient detection. It knows exactly what to do, and it calculates all of the tempo points. Here's my tempo map, and now it's much smoother and much more accurate. And that'll do us for today. Hope you enjoyed the episode. Please hit like if you did. Don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. I'll see you next time. Thanks very much.